Hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased you've joined me for today's show at My Life as a Landlord. Today is a very, very special episode as we are exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for New Mexico, Puerto Rico, Newfoundland, Labrador, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alaska, Saskatchewan, Maine, Florida, and Guam. But this episode isn't the actual episode. Today's episode is just the summary of what is live for you in the library right now. You see, for every one of these 6 US states, 2 US territories, and 2 Canadian provinces I just mentioned, there's a dedicated podcast just for you. For each one of these locations live right now in the My Life as a Landlord podcast library. You can also find them on the platform you're listening to or at the website, mylifeasalandlord.com, under location-specific resources. These location-specific episodes are brought to you by our sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments, LLC. If you want to know more about real estate investing, check out alohajv.com. In all of my location-specific episodes, I do in detail, in all of my location-specific episodes, I dive deep into detail by screen sharing and reviewing hyperlinks of all kinds of help resources into the state, province, landlord, tenant law, code, etc., everything for that geographic location that I can possibly find, along with as many location-specific things, including phone numbers, emails, web pages, associations, Facebook groups, and much more. You just never know what's going to come out of these location-specific podcasts. And every time I record more, and I am doing more, I learn more and more about what is important in that location. Things like, what happens if a home gets foreclosed on? What about bed bugs? How about non-local landlords accepting non-local payments? Rent-to-own options, landlord smoking rules defined, and all things regarding vehicles, including authorized, unauthorized, nuisance, and other vehicle types. Who knew that? That's in Tennessee. I also learned about many resources on how to help landlords just like you and me in these locations and beyond. Now, I can't do all the state, provinces, and territories in the US and Canada, Australia, and the UK all at one time. Are you trying to kill me? So I'm going to do them in overtime. My goal is to have them all done by the end of 2026. We'll see how quickly I get them done, but there will be a dedicated podcast to every province, state, territory in Canada, US, and I'm trying to go even beyond that because that's where it gets really interesting when you go super international. That's when quite of you, those of you are thinking, hey, when are you going to do my location? So just relax. I'm not going to say when we are doing these tranches of location-specific podcasts. I'm doing them as often as I possibly can, but I'm finding them really interesting. But about the 10 areas today where that just went live, including the 6 US states, 2 Canadian provinces, and 2 US territories, let's talk about the 4 areas that are my framework for each and every episode and go through a couple of examples. It's the same framework for each episode. Each podcast is set up the same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of the landlord-tenant law or code in that location? 2, what are the nuances of this location? What's different that stands out? Because I look at this stuff all the time. 3, what are some guidance about the abandoned items that are potentially left behind by a tenant? And 4, where do you get help in that local area? If you're a landlord in that local area, where do you just even start? So here's a sample of what you can expect from the 10 location-specific podcasts in this tranche. Okay, for New Mexico landlord retaliation defines a landlord cannot file for eviction, change services, do a rent increase, anything that would appear retaliatory. It all comes down to the timeline. In New Mexico, it's 6 months. Some places there is no timeline, but in New Mexico, it's 6 months. Also, in New Mexico, the terms abandonment, rumor, normal wear and tear, those are all defined. That's unique. And they also help with rent to own options, which is also different. Not many places talk about rent to own, helping a tenant actually buy the unit from the landlord. That's interesting. Puerto Rico was really unique because it was mainly contract law, and they don't have an official act as seen in other locations. There's a lot of talk about tax advantages with rentals in Puerto Rico, and it's largely not specified or under control in specific locations, but there is rent control. So it's very interesting when we're talking about rentals in Puerto Rico. In fact, it talks a lot about rentals when you are trying to move there and you're going to be a tenant there. So that's typically what I found. A very interesting location is Puerto Rico. Newfoundland, Labrador, termination without cause notice requirements. This is really interesting. So if someone has, like a landlord wants to move in, or if someone is being transferred out because they are getting relocated to an assistant home, let's just say, there is a way that you can communicate, the tenant can communicate with the landlord, and the landlord can communicate with the tenant under a special circumstance termination of a lease. And it would be the notice period to the landlord, other requirements that you actually have to present knowing this is coming up or that something has happened. And it could be for either party. But I found it really interesting that that specific location had a special circumstance notice of ending tenancy requirement. There are lots of template and ready to fill out forms, very impressive. Actually, I would say it would rival in Ontario and British Columbia. That was really neat. It also talks about tenant obligations, about no smoking tobacco, and that's because of the Smoke-Free Environmental Act, or cannabis or cultivating cannabis, that's the Cannabis Control Act. Both of those are federal in Canada. Very interesting. I have actually some of that in my British Columbia rental leases, and now I actually have the source documents, which I didn't really have before, so that was interesting. Newfoundland, Labrador, they also have they're big proponents of emergency contacts for tenants. That's really important, especially as our tenants are getting older. All right, let's go to Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, landlord is required to provide trash containers and removal if you are in an apartment. Interesting. A single-family home tenant provides lawn care automatically unless the lease specifies different. If there is criminal activity on your property, on your rental, within 24 hours, you can give notice to the tenant that the lease is terminated. Now, that doesn't mean they have to get out in 24 hours, but you can give them notice that it's terminated in 24 hours. If a tenant fails to move out, meaning there's a holdover situation, then they must pay 2 times the rent in a holdover situation, because in Oklahoma, you have an abrupt end to the lease if you have a fixed lease. Very interesting. All right, moving on to Tennessee. In Tennessee, you must have a separate bank account just for the security deposits. That's interesting. Landlord-Tenant Act only applies to certain counties over 68,000 people with certain exceptions. And this is where I mentioned earlier, authorized versus unauthorized vehicles, nuisance vehicles, other kinds of vehicles. There was a lot about vehicles in Tennessee. Interesting. All right, Alaska. Alaska specifies mobile home owners in this act. Sometimes other locations have mobile home, but it's like something separate. But this one, mobile home, is actually a part of it. It's really interesting how the section is in there. Landlord rules, they talk about how the landlord must explain the house rules in the lease, which I think is inherent, but it specifically says that in the Alaska Act. Landlord retaliation is also defined there. And it talks very specifically if there's a fire, a casualty, a damage, or a condemned premises for this rental, meaning it's just gone into disrepair or something has happened like a fire, flood, something like that. They talk a lot about that. There is an acceleration clause, meaning that if the tenant breaks the lease, they cannot have someone just automatically take over, and they're still responsible for the remainder of the lease rent. And it talks a little bit more about what happens if a property is foreclosed on. I thought this was a very good, sobering reality in Alaska of what could actually happen. And because Alaska is so rural in lots of locations, and the density of people and the density of locations, density of housing is really low, I thought it was very entertaining actually looking at some of this. All right, let's shift over to Saskatchewan. Lots of housing authorities in Saskatchewan. In Saskatchewan, rent increases cannot incur within the first 18 months and yearly thereafter, and that's if the landlord is not a member of an association about the rentals, like a landlord association, a network of nonprofit housing providers, or the Saskatchewan Landlord Association. So they're encouraging landlords to be a part of these associations. And if you are, then the landlord in Saskatchewan can then speed up how quickly they can increase the rent, because clearly they are more educated, and I believe that's part of it. And then what you can do is you can increase the rent every 12 months if you're a member in good standing in one of those networks. You have to give 6 months notice of rent increase, and you can increase every 12 months. Yeah, there's an incentive to be a part of one of these associations. Very, very unique. In Maine, affordability to remediate. And so there's a lot of what happens if the condition of the unit is too goes down and you can't afford to bring it up. That's addressed in Maine. There was a lot of talk about bed bugs in Maine and about radon. In radon, radon is a radioactive naturally occurring substance. In Maine, landlord has to have the radon tested every 10 years. You don't have to remediate, but you actually have to have the results. And you're supposed to do it every 10 years. And a tenant can request to see those results. So they have the right to know what the radon levels are in that property. They also, in Maine, you must have a smoking policy. It must be actually spelled out. And there's nothing about pets in Maine. That was interesting. So they have a lot about bed bugs and radon, but nothing about pets. All right, Florida. Let's see. Deposits in Florida rentals must be held in a separate bank account. This is an ongoing trend, but not always. And in Florida, the deposits could be held in either an interest or a non-interest bearing account. If it's like a savings account, it's interest bearing, then the percentage of how much goes to the landlord and how much goes to the tenant is dictated. And if you get an application from a military member in Florida, you must respond within 7 days from getting the application if they were approved or denied, and you have to do it in writing. Reasonable notice of entry in Florida is 12 hours. Typically, that's pretty quick. Typically, it's 24 or 48 hours. And it's very technical for eviction and possession in Florida. I've heard this from other people as well. All right, let's talk about Guam. Guam, you can tell there has been a lot of damage in the past from windstorms and hurricanes because there is a lot of notice in these tenancy laws that says if you have damage from a windstorm, you must, as a landlord, make a good faith effort for repairs. There was a lot in there about that. Pet deposit cannot exceed $500 per pet, and you can't have no more than 1 month rent total for a deposit in general. That's for the security deposit and for the pet deposit. You cannot use deposit as rent, and there is an acceleration clause if a tenant breaks a fixed lease early, meaning they are required to pay the rest of the rent out. So that's your 10 locations. So that is New Mexico, Puerto Rico, Newfoundland, Labrador, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alaska, Saskatchewan, Maine, Florida, and Guam. Now, each of my location-specific podcasts, as I mentioned, is set up the same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics? What are the nuances in that location? Guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant, and where to get help in that local location. This is the same format for every single location-specific episode, but if you're interested in another geographic area, you already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location, and it gets really more interesting as we go along. Now, I must give the disclaimer. This episode is not all-inclusive. None of them are all-inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, especially if you are in a unique position that let's say you're in a municipality or city or county or regional district, something, a parish, that has additional rules. You must do your own research. All I'm doing is getting you started. Okay, who knows? I suspect you'll be thumbing through the podcast library at My Life as a Landlord, and you'll find 1 or 2 or 10 episodes that you may just bookmark. These location episodes are almost like a soap opera, landlord style. Very cool. So if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you're either a current landlord or about to be a landlord and you want to be in a certain location. Please check out the library, because as we go through this, I'm adding more and more location-specific podcasts all the time. And there's a ton of resources in there, whether you're a seasoned landlord or you're brand new to this. Just have a little patience. I'm doing more location stuff as we go. If you learned something from today's show, could you pretty please give me a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or maybe you listen to this on our website, mylifeasalandlord.com. It doesn't matter, but your input really does help. And I hope you enjoyed today's summary show, letting you know about the 10 latest location-specific episodes waiting for you right now in the library. Today, I'm recording this episode in Maui, Hawaii. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next location-specific episode live right now in the library, episode 141, about the state where I grew up in, the land of enchantment, New Mexico. I'll see you there.